Order, order, and a very warm welcome to the third oral evidence session of the transition to the state pension age inquiry. And we have a fantastic set of panellists today. Wendy Loretto is joining us online and is from the University of Edinburgh's Business School. Professor Sarah Vickerstaff is from the University of Kent. David Finch from the Health Foundation and Quinn Roache from the TUC. So welcome everybody. Thank you for coming along this morning. I'm going to kick off the questions. And my first question is around the Pensions Commission. Clearly they have a remit which is around building a framework for a sustainable, fair and adequate pension system. What are the implications that this has for the state pension age rises for this work? Who would like to start with that? Vicky, over to you.
Thanks for inviting me. I just sort of start by saying I think we have a problem with chronology. Inevitably, we have a state pension age. And unfortunately, 66-year-olds, 67-year-olds, and maybe eventually 68-year-olds are not all equal. So if we carry on raising the state pension age, certainly until we've done some of the things that perhaps Charlie Mayfield in his Working Better report says, we will probably consign increasing number of people in the ages between 60 and state pension age to out of work poverty before they get their state pensions. So I think we really need to be careful about the assumption that a single age is a useful and a fair way of thinking about receipt of state pension.
Thank you. David, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think I'd probably look at this in kind of two aspects. One is the kind of overall sort of adequacy and fairness of the system, and then also how that plays out for different groups and the inequalities that it can bring. And I think actually if you look at the principle of a similar share of life in retirement, I mean it's a fairly sensible principle that we would support, and actually it is on average being maintained, even though life expectancy improvements have stalled. That is across all cohorts effectively. So you're not actually seeing...
Some are going down though, David, aren't they?
They are. It is.
Women in deprived areas.
I think, and I think that is the, I mean, ultimately that is the kind of underlying issue there is the inequalities, where when we look at life expectancy trends...
I have a question on that in a minute.
Okay, I'll hold that on that. I mean, I think on the sustainability and adequacy point, I mean, I suppose what is happening though is because life expectancy is not improving as quickly, and the state pension age then is or in past reports and reviews is being pushed back the further rise to 68, for example. You still have a bigger older population, which is driven more by birth cohorts, and so you don't have the same offsetting effect on spend effectively, and that impact then is exacerbated by, I suppose, what we see as rising ill health across the working and older population, and things like the triple lock, which have been kind of increasing, I suppose, a positive for adequacy, but have been kind of increasing that sustainability issue. And I'll part the inequalities then as well.
Thank you. Quinn?
I would just add that our evidence clearly points to certain groups having larger pension gaps, and they include Black, ethnic, Asian, minority workers, older workers, disabled workers, and workers who come from doing really physical occupations as well, in terms of them not being able to work up to the state pension age, and that will kind of lead to real inequality later in life, and that's a concern for the TUC.
Thank you. And now Wendy.
Thank you. Just following up on these comments, just one, I absolutely agree about the inequalities between groups, but a very stark statistic from ONS is that almost a quarter, 24% of over 50s leave work before state pension age because of unmet health support needs. So just that very stark statistic, we're looking at a quarter of this workforce leaving because of unmet health needs before they get to the current state pension.
Thank you. So I think from what you're saying, and perhaps just nod if you agree, you think that the Pensions Commission should be taking account of the state, the increase in the state pension age in there when they're looking at it overall in the system. Yeah, thank you. I think we got the affirmative there. Thank you so much. So on the point around inequalities, the Women's Budget Group says that the assumes that a uniform capacity to remain in paid work risk deepening existing inequalities. So thinking about, again, the policy around state pension age increases and so on, is that also potentially a policy which would, if it continues to rise, will exacerbate existing inequalities?
So, I mean,
David, do you want to kick
I mean, I would say at the moment, yes, the data is pointing towards that happening. I think I suppose you would ideally premise a rise in the state pension age with the ability of all groups to kind of keep pace with that rise. And what we see and I should say there are data issues with the kind of the timeliness and also the impacts of COVID on life expectancy and mortality data. But what we saw before the pandemic was kind of either stable or improvements in life expectancy across UK regions for the least deprived areas, but for people in the most deprived areas outside of the south of England, you saw declines in life expectancy. And the latest kind of post sort of 22 data that we can see sort of suggests a similar trend is happening. And I think that's where, that's a clear indication of deteriorating health in the more deprived areas. And those people are more likely to live in those more deprived areas. You do have higher rates of economic inactivity generally, worse sort of health in general in the population, and you can also tend to have kind of jobs that require more physical, have a more physical element to them, and so are actually harder for people to be doing. So I think those things combined point to a kind of problem.
Okay, so is there anybody that disagrees with what David has said, that there is the potential for continuing increases in state pension age to exacerbate inequalities without any mitigating measures? Okay, lovely. Wendy, did you want to add to that?
Very quickly, I don't disagree at all, but just to add to that, I think sometimes it's thought that the pensions adequacy is important here, and the fact that auto-enrolment, has been in place for, a long number of years now and is seen to be a success, is thought to mitigate against some of those inequalities. But what we do know is that the threshold, the £10,000 threshold, in order to be eligible for auto-enrolment, does discriminate against women, particularly women in lower salary jobs who are working part-time. So I think that compounded with the state pension age needs to be considered.
Thank you so much. Yes, of course.
Yes, I mean, the DWP published a report either yesterday or today looking at the 1958 birth cohort study and looking at their pension situation now. I think they're in their sort of middle 60s now, so it's a very good cohort to look at. And leaving aside those who are not in work, even those in work, women on defined contribution pensions typically had half the value of pension of men. So you are rolling forward a set of quite deep structural inequalities by moving the age up.
Very good point. Thank you so much. Right, I'm going to move on if that's all right, and hand over to Amanda Hack.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the panel for coming to see us today. So, what extent does the Mayfield Review chart a convincing path to better support for disabled people and those with long-term health conditions to stay in work? And that would obviously include the people we've already referenced, that Sarah commented about as 24% of over 50s leave work due to unmet health needs. So how does the Mayfield Review sort of, do you think that charts a convincing path to try and reverse some of this?
I mean, I think it's really useful and important that the Mayfield report focuses on culture and talks about a culture of fear, because dealing with ill health requires early disclosure, which requires trust and feeling safe. And if you're a low-paid woman in a sector, say, like hospitality or cleaning or retail, and you're beginning to have musculoskeletal issues, which is making work difficult, then are you going to disclose your health concerns when you sort of think, well, if I lose this job, I'm over 60, I'm not going to get another job. I can see that in the labour market. I expect ageism in the labour market. So you keep quiet. And I've interviewed women in research projects who very precisely are doing that. So I think culture is critical. My concern about the Mayfield report is that it does not anywhere talk about ageism or disableism or the factors that structure how willing people are to talk about their health, how willing people are to disclose health issues. So yes, we need to focus on culture. I think that's absolutely right, and it's a step forward that a big report's saying that. But we need a more fine-grained understanding of how culture impacts different groups.
Lovely. Wendy next, and we'll come to Quinn in a moment. Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you. Just building directly on that, we did a 3-year research project in supporting health amongst older workers aged over 50. We interviewed 150 across 4 different sectors, and very loudly and clearly, to absolutely support what Sarah was saying, there was the fear of disclosure, the double jeopardy of being labelled old and ill. So I think ageism and how it intersects with health, disableism is absolutely crucial here. I think I welcome the focus on training line managers, because I think line managers very often get an unfair rap in this case. I also welcome the focus for making more of what employers currently offer, because that was the other side of our research, that employers were frustrated when they offered services and they had a low take-up. Again, that's because of mainly because of that lack of trust and confidence to be able to disclose.
Wendy, Quinn, you wanted to come in?
Thank you. I agree with Sarah, and I agree with Wendy. I think the Mayfield review is a great report, but I think we are looking at a long-term report, 3 to 7 years before we start seeing impact, and there are older people in work right now who need support to stay in that job. And so I think from our perspective, there are things that can be done now within the existing legislative framework that can support the retention of older and disabled workers in the workplace. And our research also agrees with your points around disableism and ageism. We've done research looking at the experiences of disabled people in work, and when you cut that by age, we have around 1 in 5 saying that they were discriminated on the grounds of disability, and 1 in 4 of that group saying they were discriminated on the grounds of age. So it's a really important point that we get right.
Thank you, David. Did you want to come in?
Yeah, and I mean, I would agree with the comments from the other panellists, and I think and we do broadly agree with the thrust of the Mayfield review, and think it can ultimately make a difference. I think where our concerns lie more is there are quite strong kind of voluntary aspects to the proposals for this vanguard stage, which I think that's useful in that you want to find best practice, so you want to work with the employers that are doing these things already. There's almost an equivalent lack of plans from the government to put in the types of structures that you need from the policy system to support those types of activities. So things like more generous statutory sick pay, and also thinking about the incentives in the benefits system, which tend to kind of incentivise people away from the workforce effectively if they have ill health, rather than having a much more kind of preventative and more responsive approach, which helps to sort of keep people attached to the labour market. So I think without those kind of supporting structures, you might risk finding out what works really well, but then it's not as effective because you don't have that wider system in place.
That's really useful, thank you. So Tom Pollard from Mine said that while the review identified structural barriers, and I think we've got onto a little bit of that as well, it spent relatively little time analysing them. Do you agree, and what do you think needs more attention? Anybody want to come in? Sarah, you...
Where to start? I think what the report has to say about workplace health provision is really useful. but does point us to a whole set of problems, which I think David was just alluding to, that we don't have a joined up system of responding to workplace ill health, leaving aside the issues about disclosure and things, that yes, large employers may well have occupational health, may well have quite good systems in place, and may have managed to build a trust culture in which people are confident to come forward. But of course, lots of people don't work in those kinds of settings. So, I mean, there has been a trend in occupational health away from in-house occupational health to, you know, online employment assistance programs, essentially a telephone line. Well, if you're someone who's worrying about, you know, their mental health, or you're worrying about your physical health, your ability to do your work, you know, a telephone line may simply not be a very adequate mechanism. So, you know, we have lost some of the good practice we used to have around occupational health. And now, as the report identifies, we need to rebuild that workplace health provision, and we need to do it from, you know, the ground up to some extent, through, you know, localised coalitions that bring social prescribers, the NHS, employers, DWP together to look at ways in which small and medium-sized companies can access robust information about how to deal with someone, let's say with, you know, dodgy knees or arthritic hands.
Thank you. Anybody else want to come in?
David. Yeah, I'd just add that, I mean, I think it's also about not always over-medicalising the concern. So although it may be presenting as a health issue, often people will have other factors that are affecting their ability to work. So it's really having that kind of more holistic approach, where I think we've previously recommended, and there is, you know, the Mayfield review sort of point towards this, more of a sort of case management approach, effectively, where you're actually understanding what people's problems are and resolving them. And it may be that those are health issues, or it may be that there are other issues that mean that the health issue becomes a problem for your ability to work. But I think it's really having looking at the barriers as a whole, and not just thinking it's about getting people to some healthcare treatment.
Lovely, thank you. Quinn, you felt like did you want to come in?
No, actually I have nothing to add.
Thank you. I think we've covered the last question, so I'm happy to.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Amanda. John Mill.
Thank you, and good morning. The Mayfield report puts emphasis on working with vanguard employers to work out best practice in a positive feedback intelligence loop, which could take some years. But of course, the other challenge is actually implementing it. Practical measures across all the other companies that aren't in that group. Do you think the report has the balance right? Is it concentrating too much on the coalition of the willing and the employers who perhaps might be best practice in the first place? Well, who would like to?
I can start with that. I mean, I think I sort of briefly mentioned this earlier. I mean, I think to some extent, if you're looking for best practice, you are going to have to work with those more sort of active employers in the first place. And I think an important part of the approach is to make it employer-led, so that hopefully you are getting something at the end of it which employers are willing to sort of engage with and take up, and actually works for them, rather than perhaps government developing something that doesn't quite meet their needs. Because we have had lots of standards in the past and they haven't necessarily worked well. I mean, I think the big challenge is finding something that is, I suppose, ultimately goes beyond a statutory minimum and it actually does achieve that wider take-up. I don't have like an answer as to how you do that, and I think part of the problem is that some of this will relate to culture. Some of this is about the role of line managers, and yet that's been known for quite a while, but it's very hard to actually see those things actually lead to change. So I think that is a really big challenge. But I mean, I think they're starting in the right place. I think it's just very hard to get to that point where you scale up the intervention without necessarily bringing in massively lifting up the regulatory minimum.
Thank you. Wendy, I think you wanted to come in there.
Thank you. This is also relevant to the previous point. A good news. Sorry, I think in terms of resources, yes. There's, we absolutely acknowledge that some employers will be more positively motivated, and getting good practice from them is helpful. But how do we roll that out? There is positive work being done through the WISPAS network, which I can send the link to Juna, and that is been led by a coalition of universities led by University of Birmingham, which is evaluating local government free at point of use occupational health services, and that is obviously targeted towards particularly SMEs. And that the research programme is looking to evaluate, which leads me on to, I think, probably a tandem issue. It's not just actually rolling things out, it's knowing what works. And there was a really useful report produced by Institute of Occupational Medicine and the British, I think it was Health and Safety Commission in November 2024, that said we do not have the data. We simply, data that evaluate what works are partial, they're lagging, and we need to know what works. So I think that has to be done in tandem with also the rollout.
Thank you. Any other comments?
I agree with both contributions. The only thing that I think I would add is, in the interim between the Mayfield Review report kind of starting to provide best practice and spreading it, one of the things that we think could happen and should happen is to strengthen the Equality Human Rights Commission. They are currently understaffed compared to when they started and underfunded, and we think one of the things that's lacking in this space when you talk about ageism, you talk about discrimination on the grounds of disability or access to reasonable adjustments, is a disincentive to breach the law. So we know from my hat, when you think about reasonable adjustments, the duty to put them in place has existed for 30 years, but it's still not happening on the ground. And those are the things that this age group will need to stay in work. So one of the things we think could happen, and maybe was missed out of this, was strengthening the arm of the regulator to prove a real disincentive to employers.
Thank you. And another cohort that is argued is neglected in the report is smaller businesses. It does concentrate on large and companies of 250 people, etc. But many disabled people are actually employed by small companies. Do you think there's an omission there? Sarah, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that we need to come at this from all directions. So, yes, you go to the big employers who've got the resources and the inclination, and you see what they're doing and you try and spread that out. But I think, we could make, as Quinn was suggesting, better use of some of the things that we already have. So if you think about access to work, which can help small employers, the backlog of cases on that is a real disincentive. So there's something that can be used, but actually can't be very readily and quickly used. We have 50-plus champions in job centres who, presumably hopefully have good local networks with local, medium and small sized employers and can, give advice and help about that, to the job seekers. So, there's a lot of things that already exist that and to be fair to Charlie Mayfield, he was, taking the broad vision. So, I think if we just stick with the vanguard, we'll have problems. We'll probably be here in 3 or 4 years' time and not have moved very far forward for lots of people. But if we try and use some of the things that already exist and make them better, then we'll be coming at the problem from the bottom as well as from the top.
Any other comments?
I'd just add, I think there's obviously a kind of resource issue with the smaller businesses to actually engage with this type of activity. So I think the important thing will be making sure that when you're finding best practice in the larger employers, you are also doing some kind of parallel exercise in translating that to smaller businesses and engaging with them in how they could sort of make that work for themselves. But then also thinking about how do you actually provide them with a more lower cost solution effectively. Because I think, and again, I think the Mayfield Review touches on it in a couple of places, but there are things you could potentially look at through insurance markets or through sort of supporting some kind of low-cost, high-quality provision that means that smaller businesses could access that type of support in a sort of aggregate fashion effectively, rather than, I think at the moment, if you're accessing it individually, you tend to get you're definitely getting a higher per person cost through that provision.
Moving on then, this next question actually for you, David, first. You've advocated for a sectoral approach. What might that look like?
Well, I think we've talked about this for two main reasons, really, and I think there are obviously things that cut across, all employment that are important to be focusing on. But then specific sectors do have different health challenges. That might be due to the type of work they're doing. It might be to do with the kind of the age structure or the demographic of the workforce. I suppose you think things like transport or logistics, they're quite strictly built into how those sectors are designed. That means you have things like late shift patterns and sedentary roles and things. So there's I think, so to tackle some of those challenges, really you need to operate across the sector and think about how you change those ways of working and job design. And often I think it's partly because there may be competitive advantage in not moving, which will stop other people moving potentially. But I think it requires that kind of that coordination across the sector to make a difference. It's whether these kind of built-in structural problems. I think the other area is in thinking about the public sector, and where we've looked at kind of work that is effectively associated with kind of harm to health, either exacerbating a health condition or through or sort of creating the health problem. There are particular kind of warning signs in the public sector, particularly in education, healthcare, and the social care sectors. And I suppose that's where actually the government could be playing more of a role as a kind of as a provider of kind of best practice and making sure that they're changing things in a way that would actually send out signals to the rest of the employment sector.
Yeah, thank you. Any other?
I mean, I think I completely agree with David that, there are big sectoral differences, but this may be another way in which we can approach this from below, in the sense that if you take something like construction, where you do have a preponderance of older workers who have, typically quite a lot of musculoskeletal issues. Even, small operators and self-employed tend to be quite well linked into industry networks of one sort or another because they're important for their business. So using those kinds of sectoral organisations that exist, to sort of spread ideas, spread good practice. You're then asking someone to approach someone they already approach for advice and support on things, rather than someone remote or disconnected. So again, I think there's lots of ways in which we could mobilise existing resources better than we currently do.
Thank you. David, question for you specifically. You actually touched on this a moment ago. So you argue that government departments could set up, make an example in areas like health and education, but evidence from UNISON suggests that this would be challenging given the nature of the jobs and the challenges on pressures on services. How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, I mean, I suppose in a way I would say the kind of the levels of burnout that you're seeing reported in the data suggests that is because of constrained resources within those sectors. But I think as ever there are always ways of effectively organising your operations differently and taking account of some of these things. And there are examples where, for example, of increasing flexible working within nurses' shift patterns and things like that, for example. So there are things you can do within the system. I think it almost goes back to that problem where you often hear and find case studies of good practice, but it's not spread across the system. And that I think. And I think there's a role there for the overall employer and government to effectively sort of push for those changes through the system as a whole, rather than letting these little pockets emerge, but then that not becoming best practice across the whole.
Thank you. And Wendy, I didn't notice your hand was up there. You may have been coming in on the previous question.
I did, but it relates to this as well. And I think I support the sectoral approach that's been advocated, but I don't think we should ignore that it's job specific. So going back to where David started, you talked about shift work, for example, David, and we did work with a bank, and a national bank employs 66,000 employees in the UK, and actually you could dismiss that as financial services, white collar, relatively low risk, a particular type of occupational health support required. But they too have transport workers, they too have shift workers. People who work in cash offices are working in very manual jobs to social. So I think we do have to, I know it's complicated, but we do have to layer that in and think about the actual work as well. And then just to come in this current point, I would really support, and it came very strongly through our research, we are not using existing resources effectively enough. Employers are offering things. There's a wide raft of community supports that are there. NHS, as I mentioned, offer a lot. We do not use them. So I think a lot of this is about how we better use what we have, how we help people, put people in touch with the resources, and employers know as well the resources that they can offer. They don't have to pay for them, but they could create and offer the direction to those resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. Arguably, the vanguard phase should include a group of employers focused specifically on the needs of older workers. I just wondered if you could touch on some of the key challenges faced by older workers and how that could be addressed in a strategy for older workers. Wendy, could I start with you?
Yes, you could, and I think we'll go back to what both Sarah and I had mentioned earlier. That we have worked jointly together as well as separately, but this is going back, that there really is that double jeopardy of ageism and disableism that I think really does intersect in a way to uniquely affect those aged over 50. So that is definitely an issue. I think there's also the notion when we started off talking about state pension age. There's also, I think, there've been over-reliance on financial reasons that people will retire or stay in work. That if we simply make it more financially difficult for people to retire, that they will stay longer. That is not the case from our research over a long number of years. It is far more complicated. People are, they've got their own health issues, they've got caring responsibilities, they have got all sorts of assumptions that are not necessarily rational, but beliefs that if they stay and work too long and retire late, everybody knows somebody who worked later and then dropped dead within the next fortnight. Sarah has written on that. So I think this over rationality and reliance on finance is difficult. The other area that I think we would probably want to highlight, and it may be relevant for some of your other questions, is the other options available to over 50s. So Australia is much further on than we are in recognising the value of social production, the value of caring for elderly, for spouses, for elderly relatives, for caring for grandchildren in terms of the contribution that's making to our economy. These are viable options for many older workers, and sometimes a relatively minor health issue, not necessarily a long-term diagnosable condition, but a relatively minor issue is enough to tip somebody into saying, I'm going to give up work because there are these other pools on their time, and arguably their valuable contribution to our economy and society.
Thank you. I mean, we touched on quite a few of the points in previous questions. I'm just speaking to the panel in the room. The interventions that would be effective in supporting people in their 60s to remain in work, could you maybe bring some of those to life? Quinn?
Go on.
I mean, I think I was going to touch back on what I mentioned earlier, which is around employers putting in place reasonable adjustments for older disabled workers. I think it's vitally important that we understand the context that's happening right now, which is that employers are failing to put in place reasonable adjustments for a vast number of disabled older workers. And when an older worker who's disabled puts in a request, they're often waiting months to over a year to get the reasonable adjustments they need put in place. So if you think about this group of people and the impact that will have on their health and their ability to stay in work, it is vast. So when I talk about making best use of things that we already have, I literally am thinking about this 30-year duty to put in place reasonable adjustments. Getting it right is so important for this group of individuals. And I think we also need to think about what reasonable adjustments are. So flexible working, i.e. Changing your work patterns, your shift patterns, your time, that is a reasonable adjustment. And older workers have two ways of getting to that now. They have it as a reasonable adjustment, but they also have it through the Employment Rights Act as a right to request flexible working. So I think we need to be aware of the dual track nature of this, and I think reasonable adjustments are a powerful tool that we aren't getting right.
I mean, just building on that, some of the points made by previous questions around, caring duties as well. There are people that have had physical jobs. There are a lot of different challenges faced by people in their 60s to remain in work. Do you think government policies such as fiscal policies could also be brought in to help support those remaining work. I'll give an example. If you're of retirement age and you remain in work, the national insurance element was historically not paid as an incentive. Do you think that could be brought more to the fore in providing support for those in their 60s to remain in work? Policies like that?
Well, as Wendy alluded to, I think the actual decision architecture for someone in their 60s about whether to stay in work or to leave is very complicated. And it is a mixture of their health, the health of their family members, any caring responsibilities they have, their financial situation, you know, what other things they might want to do. So, yes, I mean, I think, you know, tax arrangements can be a push, and often people imagine in advance that they will retire earlier than they actually do. So they look ahead and think, well, I'll probably go at sort of 63. But when they get to 63, they think, well, maybe I'll go at 66. So, I mean, I think, you know, those sorts of incentives can be part of, you know, a range of things that are in the, you know, what I've just called the decision architecture that someone finds themselves in. It's probably not going to be the key factor, but in a sense, none of these things are the key factor. It's the combination of them that keeps somebody in, and also what your employer is doing and offering that keeps you in or propels you out. And to go back to Quinn's point about reasonable adjustments, you know, there is an argument as to whether people understand the criteria for accessing reasonable adjustments. Is it just that you're defined as disabled by law, or is it wider than that? So, you know, there's another example of something that, as Quinn has suggested, we're not using as well as we might do. If you think of the very large numbers of people with musculoskeletal problems in their 60s, a lot of those, like myself with osteoarthritis, do not, you know, we're not labelled, or we don't qualify as disabled under equalities legislation, but our ability to work may be quite, you know, severely impacted. And, you know, the example I always give for myself, you know, a stand-up, sit-down desk that allows me to vary my work position is a relatively small and inexpensive adjustment, but which might really make a difference about my ability to carry on working. So let's make better use of the things that we've already got.
David, have you got anything else to add on that?
I mean, I think the only things I'd add is I think often it is about applying the types of things we've been talking about previously, but also making sure you're doing it early enough before issues become too severe that they're affecting your actual ability to work. Because, you know, as people in older age groups tend to have multiple health conditions as well, so it becomes much more complicated to actually tackle each one in turn, and they can interact, which makes it harder still. Whereas, you know, those have developed over time, and if you're putting in place maybe smaller adjustments that actually perhaps stop that becoming exacerbated as you age, and, you know, it shows that you have a route to being able to manage the condition and work at the same time. But doing it earlier, I think it's just very late to act at sort of 62 when perhaps, you know, something started to affect your ability to work in your 50s. I mean, I think the other thing that tends to be missing is a kind of active job matching for people who perhaps can't continue in the occupation they currently have, but could do some form of work. And I think often they are left to just trying to find that job and may not understand the opportunities that are available. So I think there is a potential role for some kind of job matching support, probably locally delivered, to help sort of match people to jobs, and also to help get employers to realise you know, that their jobs could be adapted to other people.
Wendy, just some final brief comments from you.
Very briefly, to answer the question about the tax and financial incentives, I think it's the changes that are very difficult. So we did some work back in 2009, I think it was, with DWP and trust and confidence in pensions, when the increase in state patronage was first mooted. And I think the trust and confidence, fair to say, was low, and it's got lower. And that's because people are talking in an interview about change. So they can't plan, they can't prepare. So I think bringing, you know, people ideally want to start preparing earlier, but the constant changes as they see it, it reduces the trust and confidence further. So whatever is done needs to be in place for some time, that people will have trust and confidence in that it will endure to see them through to their retirement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. David Baines.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, everyone. So Charlie Mayfield suggested to us that we invite him back in 12 months to report on progress in developing the healthy working life cycle. What do you think we should expect to see by then, and what do you think we will see?
I'm happy to start. I think, I mean, I suppose I would sort of caution some patience, I suppose, effectively, that I think it's 12 months is, it's a period of time, but it is also not that much time to make huge progress in it. And effectively, if you're thinking about trying to sort of marshal the different employers that have signed up to the Vanguard and collect evidence, I mean, I'd hope it would be in a position where there are some really clear plans for the following sort of couple of years of the programme, that employers are already actively engaging in their sort of in their process, and if they are testing things, those are kind of lined up to be happening and have been designed and ready to go. I mean, I think it'd be quite optimistic to think he'll have all the answers at that point and will have managed to sort of make massive progress. I mean, I think in a I think for in a sort of note of caution around just, I suppose, seeing that it's really firmly on track for delivery within the time period, and that he has a good sense of the parameters of what will come through, and is almost trying to fill the gaps in what isn't there, is probably where you'd hope it would be get to, like real clarity that it's moving forward and it's got good direction. So it might be slightly pessimistic, but I just think I suppose from experience of trying to set up like programs engaging with different either local authorities or employers and things, I mean, it does take a bit of time to get things moving. So.
I mean, I'd agree with that, but I would hope that the Workplace Health Intelligence Unit that is proposed has been established, because I think that is a mechanism for collating and translating robust information about what works, and perhaps even commissioning more research to test out different ideas. But yeah, I don't honestly think we could expect a major transformation within the space of a year or even 3. But I think he points to some good developments, and I think the Workplace Health Intelligence Unit would be a very good way of aggregating a lot of the issues that we've been talking about, and sending those down to individuals and employers.
Wendy?
Thank you. Yes, very briefly. Well, we've talked about the complexity. We've talked about really changing attitudes and expectations from employees as well about retirement. That will take time, but I also think we do know some things that work, and some things that are fairly simple, and some things that do not necessarily cost employers a lot, and actually gathering those and seeing what we can make a difference in. If I give you one example, the work that we've done with Age Scotland, and that's around about flexible working policies. It's not going to be the answer for everybody, but if organisations have a look at their flexible working policies, look at the imagery on it, look at the examples, what we're finding with Age Scotland, they were very much focused about parents of young children and around about parental leave, and actually making those more inclusive to include older people, because people, as Sarah was saying, are not aware. They're not aware that these policies apply to them. So I think there's some things we can do. Quick wins is maybe a bit of a cheesy phrase, but I think there are some things we can probably do quickly in that dissemination of good practice, that and assuring employees these are not costly or terribly intrusive.
So I mean, just going off of Wendy's point about other things that are really impactful and are coming down the line, so slightly outside of the Mayfield review angle, but I actually have a lot of faith that employers will be taking this area a lot more seriously. We have ethnicity and disability pay gap reporting coming down the line, and while pay gap reporting is absolutely essential, what's really coming down the line with that are meaningful action plans that are driven by data, and that is what we need. We need employers to actually look at the impacts that they're having on older workers who are disabled or Black, and think about how they can change their culture. So we've heard a lot from particularly Sarah and Wendy about ageism and disability, and I would anticipate any employer who does pay gap reporting accurately is going to come across several things as standard, lack of reasonable adjustments, discrimination in the workplace, bullying, harassment. That's what our research shows are real issues holding these workers back and also encouraging them to leave work. So I think 12 months down the line, I'm really excited for that and meaningful action plans.
Thank you. Rishnara Ali.
Thank you, Chair. The increase from 66 to 67 that was legislated in 2014, as you know, starts in April, and there are no mitigations in terms of additional social security support for that cohort. Do you think there is a case for doing something now, and how would you make that case? I'll start with David.
Yeah, sure. So I do think there is a case for mitigation there, and it relates back to the kind of inequality, the patterns we're seeing in inequalities, where it's quite clear from the from life expectancy data that you have that people living in more deprived areas, effectively outside of the south of England, are seeing their life expectancy reduce, which you would expect to translate into that part of the cohort not living for as long beyond state pension age, and it also indicates kind of worse general health in that population. And then we've also seen the kind of rise in economic inactivity due to ill health over recent years, which, I mean, it's quite hard to interrogate the data properly because there are concerns with what that data shows you, but what we do know is historically that you have really limited chances of coming back into work if you've left due to ill health, and so we would expect that rise will have led to an additional, this cohort approaching state pension age, there to be additional people who have left the workforce earlier than previous cohorts have effectively, which points to a kind of exacerbation of inequality. So you can, I think, you can accept, well, potentially you can accept that you have a single state pension age, which leads to some inequality, but the nature of trends in health and employment outcomes around this increase in state pension age are making those inequalities worse, effectively. And on mitigation, what we would point to really is, and it is trying to think pragmatically about what exists in the system already, is effectively topping up universal credit payments for people who are unable to work due to their health, and to meet the kind of pension credit level. I think obviously there are potential issues with that being, it creates an incentive for people to perhaps stop working a bit earlier. But I do think you could look at things like duration of time out of work due to ill health before that point, so you're not just getting a kind of inflow of people aged 66.
Quinn, over to you.
I think I agree with a lot of what's been said. We actually do think there are mitigations that should be put in place for this area. Specifically, we'd like people who have no realistic prospect of returning to work, once they've dropped out, to be able to draw on their state pension sooner rather than at pension age, if there's no realistic prospect of them working. We do think state pension age and pension credits should be decoupled to allow for earlier access, because we don't think universal credit is it's not quite enough. It's not as beneficial. So, and then we think there's some issues around universal credit that could really be addressed to make things better. One of the things that I think we put in our submission is around the how much you can have in savings. So we know that if you have £16,000 in savings, which you're saving for retirement, that you have to kind of whittle that down, and that means that when you are actually in retirement, you might actually have to draw on universal credit. So we think there's some issues around universal credit that can be addressed to make it better for older people, but hopefully they don't really need to be using it.
Sarah.
I would just add to what's already been said, a word we haven't heard yet, which is about dignity. And that for people who have no prospect of getting back into work, and may have a smaller or larger gap between when they left work and when they get their state pension. I've interviewed many people in projects over the years on incapacity benefit as it was and employment support allowance now. And they look forward to their state pension because they see it as an honourable earned right for having worked and contributed, whereas being on ill health benefits of one sort or another is seen as dishonourable. So I think for those, well, we need to address why that is, why we have a culture that feels those benefits are dishonourable. But I think for people who have no practical prospect of getting back to work, then, you know, there are issues around their dignity in terms of the benefits that they're on. And, of course, we know that if someone is out of work, they're more likely to be depressed. And if you then add in the stigma of you know, collecting certain benefits, then, you know, that's not helping their health either. So I just thought we should remember you know, questions of dignity and all of this as well.
Wendy, did you want to add anything to this question?
Very quickly, it's not a quick fix by any means, but I think some notion of social credits, to go back to my comment earlier about the social productions. So if people are, you know, contributions to economy and society through volunteering, through caring, you know, through grandparenting, then is there a system of social credits that could be used to, you know, to supplement our you know, benefits that are currently exist?
Okay, thank you. So turning to what options the government may have to, given the urgency of this issue. We know that there are some estimates suggesting that the change, this particular change, would save public spending by about 10 billion, and the interventions to try and mitigate could range between 200 to 600 million, depending on you know, who's in scope and how an intervention might be formulated. Do you think that's something that the government should be looking at as quickly as possible? And what age should, if support was available to do that mitigation, what age would you recommend it kicks in? Or should it be based on the points you made earlier about?
It goes back to chronology again, I think. You know, all 50-year-olds, all 55-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 65s are not equal. And therefore there will be some people in their early 50s who are in circumstances that mean their ability to get back into work or stay in work are severely prejudiced. You know, there'll be other 64-year-olds who were doing fine and then have a health incident or event. So I think you've got to... In terms
of the 66, 67, that cohort, in terms of the pension age changing?
Well, I think you need to look at the individual circumstances.
Thank you. Who else was...
I mean, I would say if you're very specifically focused on that 66 to 67, then the additional mitigation should be coming in at the point you would have reached your previous state pension age, effectively. I mean, that won't deal with wider problems and inequalities created by having a single state pension age and failing to keep people healthy and in work through their lifetimes, but would be the most kind of direct bit of mitigation there.
Quinn, did you want to come in?
Just to add, I think one, we would really need my pensions expert, but based on the information that he has provided me, I think what we would say is that these mitigations should be based around circumstances. So, for example, we know there are a group of older disabled workers who will not make it to pension age, but they will be accruing a pension. So we think that one of the mitigations would be around allowing them access to it at an earlier point.
Wendy?
Thank you. Apologies, my battery might just disappear. Apologies. I think this needs to be done earlier. So I agree about individual differences, but I think we should start intervening earlier now. So DWP, for example, had started to look at midlife MOT. Midlife is probably up for questioning as well, but bringing this much earlier for people. One of the clear findings we've had from successive pieces of research is that employers are afraid of having these sorts of conversations because they are afraid of being labelled as ageist. But actually what's happening in practice is that the employees now feel they're just been ignored, that because employers are not speaking to them, they're just ignored. So I think right now, implementing this further down at a younger age would help older workers, current and future.
Yeah, but in just going back to what government options, given April is not far away for 66 and 67-year-olds, do you have suggestions on what government could do quickly to mitigate? And given that there'll be a number of people who are going to be pushed into poverty, is there anything specific that you think within this time frame the government should be doing, could be doing?
I mean, the most immediate and effective thing would be to increase top up through universal credit effectively, because that is something that they should be able to do quite quickly. I think there are things you could do, like the types of support we've been talking about earlier that you could bring in, because this is obviously a whole cohort of people. It's not just the next sort of year's worth of retirees. So you could look to do those things, but I just think you're limited in your ability to change someone's trajectory out of work if you're acting so late in the day effectively. But it shouldn't mean you don't try.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to add anything to that? Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And that concludes this oral evidence session for this panel. David, Sarah, Quinn and Wendy, thank you so much for your very compelling evidence. Really enjoyed this. Thank you. Order. Order, and welcome back to the oral evidence session for the second panel for this transition to state pension age inquiry. And it's a pleasure to welcome for the second panel Emily Holzhausen from Carers UK, Joe Levenson from Arthritis UK, Charles Cotton from the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, and John Richards from UNISON. So thank you all for joining us here. I'm going to start. Quite similar questions to the first panel, and I wanted to think in terms of the Pensions Commission and obviously their remit around developing the framework for a sustainable, fair and adequate pension, and how the state pension age increases should be considered by them. Who would like to start that?
I'm very happy to start.
Thank you,
when
Emily.
I talk about caring, I'm talking about family members and close friends who are caring for older, ill and disabled relatives. So as a lot of witnesses have said, there are definitely structural issues that mean that people with caring responsibilities are much more likely to be out of work, and these need to be taken account of. So the more that we move the state pension up, the more likely they are to have to give up work. So around 600 people a day give up work to care, and they are up to twice as likely to be in poverty compared with non-carers because of the benefit rates. Simply, carers allowance is one of the lowest benefit of its kind. So we need to look at the structural issues that keep people in work for longer. Part of that is based on employers. Part of it is also around universal credit. And we need to also think, as some of the previous witnesses said, about those people who have no choice but to give up work in order to care and their benefit levels. But I can come on to that more later.
Thanks, Emily.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, a lot of the Pensions Commission work's been really important and focused on that. I think a lot of the pensions work done so far by the government has been very structural and very focused on, pooling in the local government pension scheme, or focused on particularly financial impact. And so we would be very keen for the Pension Commission to do work in the wider aspect, look at the social impact of pensions, and particularly this transition age, I think, is really important with the move back to 66 to 67. So having a wider focus than the rather narrow way that government work has done so far, I think would be very welcome.
Okay. Do you want to?
Yeah, and thank you very much for the chance to speak. Every day, 1,200 people get diagnosed with arthritis, and we know that a significant number are unable to work at some stage because of arthritis. Around half of people tell us they struggle to work. It has an impact on their ability to be employed. And so I think that's the context for our worries about the transition to a higher state pension age. I think it's also why we'd welcome a wider focus from the Pensions Commission. I think we need to take a joined-up view on all the different factors that impact on people's ability to earn, particularly in later life. And we know, unfortunately, if you have a health condition, you really may well struggle to get employment, to stay employment, and you may struggle financially, particularly if you have to wait longer to access a state pension or private pension provision.
Charles?
Thank you for inviting me and the CIPD to your evidence session. Like everybody else, we agree that the review should be wider. Firstly, employers can be overlooked often in the discussions about pensions and retirement. Yet not only do employers contribute to the pension arrangements of their employees for workplace pensions, but also by paying employer national insurance contributions, they're contributing towards the state pension as well. And all this represents a considerable amount of money, so any review of the state pension age and pension adequacy should consider these perspectives. Secondly, obviously employers, we employ people, so how we design jobs, tasks, how we design the organisation, and then how we manage, develop and reward employees has an impact in helping them stay in work or return to work after an absence. And also how HR professionals support their line managers when line managers are having conversations around health and well-being with their employees to encourage them to be open and talk about the different options that the organisation may have to help them cope with the illness or return to work. So we should have a wide review, because obviously the state pension as well often is an anchor point for employees in their decisions about when to stay with the organisation or when to leave. So that will have an impact, and obviously it's going to have more of an impact for low-wage workers where the state pension is more of an income compared to those middle and higher earners. But obviously we recognise that it's a difficult balancing act between cost and fairness.
Thank you. So then I'll ask the same question I asked the previous panel. Is there a uniform agreement then that the Pensions Commission, which will be publishing at the beginning of next year, I understand, whose remit is to look at adequacy and fairness within the system, should also be considering then the increases in state pension age? Yes. And the impact on that? Thank you so much. Now, I think this is specifically for Emily, Jo and John, thinking about the increases in the state pension age since 2010. What have been the observable impacts on the people that you work with on those increases? Emily, you mentioned in terms of the increase in poverty, but what else has been the impact that you've observed?
Well, I'd like to put some figures on the difference. You know, what impact does this make when we raise the level of the state pension age? The differential between the welfare benefits is really quite stark. So we have about 26,000 carers in the age cohort, in one age cohort. And if we put the state pension age up, the differential in working age benefits and pension credit and the additions that you get as a carer is approximately £134 a week. So that additional year is approximately £182 million where the government gains, but that is no longer available for unpaid carers. And what we see is that we've got quite a large number of carers who also have health conditions themselves. Some develop completely not related to caring, but many affected by caring. There's a bigger health differential, and they are musculoskeletal, mental health, and high blood pressure. So we've got, as some of the earlier witnesses said, we've got more complex issues going on for people. These affect women more than men as well. It's gendered, and we see that largely people don't have a choice about caring. So where one really important factor in how much care they have to take on, and you know the value of their care is 184 billion a year, is the availability of social care services, for example, which have been under pressure. We accept that childcare is a key foundational service for parents to be able to work. So that's what we also need to see for those people.
Thank you. Very brief answers if that's okay.
Yep, sure. The Institute for Fiscal Studies reckoned that there are a 14% increase in absolute income poverty from the 2018-20 change from 65 to 66 to 26, and that the 67 move will potentially, Age UK reckon, another 115,000 people will be put into poverty. So there's a direct impact of the change. For workers on the ground, we gave some evidence in our written evidence about the direct impact of longer working on people in schools, as school cleaners, you know, physically challenging work. The longer you go, the more difficult it is to be able to do some of the jobs. School technicians who do a lot of lifting of equipment around that, it becomes more difficult to do so. I'll try and talk about our ambulance service survey later because that gives some particular interesting views on what they think about this. But also there's issues about mental health as well, and some other surveys we've got about NHS employment I'll touch on a bit later, but there's some clear issues. I know there was a discussion earlier about sector versus individual. I think I will pull out some of that evidence.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, I think what we've seen really is a perfect storm for many people living with arthritis. We've seen cost of living pressures, we've seen a stalling of healthy life expectancy, which I think we really need to consider in the context of this inquiry. We've seen an increase in state pension age, we've seen increased inequalities, including about healthy life expectancy, and we've seen continued long waits for many people trying to access NHS treatment, particularly community MSK services. And I think when you take those factors together, and people living for longer with often several serious long-term conditions, it's maybe no surprise that we're seeing a situation where lots of people living with arthritis report struggling to get by financially. And our own research, we carried out a survey which we published towards the end of last year. We surveyed 8,000 people living with arthritis, so a big representative sample, which showed that once people were over state pension age, they were far less likely to report struggling to get by financially, almost twice as unlikely to struggle to get by financially as the cohort immediately before state pension age. So I think that speaks volumes. It shows that we are failing people, and I think we're worried that people living with arthritis and many other long-term health conditions are really collateral damage in the changes that we've seen and the increased rise in state pension age without mitigation.
Thank you. Charles, this is just a very quick one, if you could. What changes have you seen employers make with the increase in state pension age?
Well, I think employers are recognising that the workforce, as well as the population, is ageing. So we've seen initiatives around flexible working opportunities, tackling anti-age bias.
Are we able to quantify that? I mean, what proportion of apart from the right to request, legal right to request flexible working, what percentage of employers are then providing that?
Well, we found that recently around 40% of organisations, so they offered flexible working. Now, that's a survey of all employers, and if you look at it by size, it's far higher in larger organisations. So I think, as was mentioned earlier, it's the challenge of how do you raise awareness of what is possible. And I recognise that if you're a small or micro-sized business, that, you know, and you're running it, you're just going to be focused on what can you do to kind of keep the organisation afloat. Though we should also recognise that by age, you are more likely to be in business on your own, or actually running a business if you're in your 55 and over, compared to other demographics. So hopefully you would be more aware of the challenges of being older. And we are recently started working, supporting the Wishes project, which is looking at job crafting, which I don't know you may have come across already in your reviews, but it can result both in higher performance as well as improved health and well-being. And job crafting is about helping those people with health conditions either into work or remain at work, and the focus isn't on trying to necessarily fix people's health and disability, but on the social and organisational contexts that can act to disable them.
That sounds wonderful. We'll probably write to you to get a bit more information about
that.
Yes,
by all means.
Thank you so much. John Milne.
Thank you, Chair. And this first question, if I may, is for Joe and John specifically. The Health Foundation identifies the prevalence of health-harming work as a challenge. To what extent would you agree, and what options do you think are available to move to more appropriate work? Joe, if you want to kick off.
Yeah, sure. While we know that for many people work is good for them, you're absolutely right. There are some forms of work that are health harming, and particularly if you've got pre-existing conditions. So we're really worried about that. We're also very aware that some form of work itself leads to injuries. So certainly in our case, many forms of work can lead to MSK issues and injuries. And this happens across the board. I mean, in the NHS alone, 3 million working days are lost each year because of MSK conditions. So I think employers they've got to step up, really. They've got to provide a safe environment. We'd like to see the Health and Safety Executive play, I think, more of an assertive role, actually, when it comes to this. And I think it also links back to what we've heard earlier about the reasonable adjustments that need to be in place to enable people to work safely, but for a workplace environment to adapt to their needs. We know lots of people have got a lot to offer. They can still provide a lot to offer in industries that can have the potential to be health harming, but there's a difference there should be a difference between potential and actual here. So I think we need to do more to bridge that gap.
Thank you. John.
And yes, and just to add to that, I think it goes back to what we talked about a bit earlier around differentials between sectors. Well-regulated, larger public sector organisations, to an extent, tend to have better policies, tend to have better work. In areas such as social care, which are very small employers, rapidly changing, quite dominated by large private equity firms, and therefore the focus is very much on getting throughput. So we have issues with social care workers being forced to do 15-minute appointments, not getting travel time, issues like that. In a sense, it puts themselves in very difficult positions to refuse to work, and a lot of people are presenting at work when they shouldn't be well. They're putting themselves in difficult positions, lone working, and I think that there's some particular issues in social care, I think, that need doing. If you look at the health service, there are huge problems in stress due to shortages of staff. The University of Bath did a survey not too long ago looking at the reasons why staff leave NHS employment, and by far the two largest issues were stress and shortage of staff and resources. So clearly there's all that interlinked way of the impact of stress on staff and their ability to continue work.
Thank you. And this is a question for you, Charles, in particular. To what extent do the employers that you work with prepare people to move to more appropriate work?
Well, again, some of the larger organisations are looking at things like midlife MOTs and talking to their employees about not only their physical and mental health, but also their financial situation and what they can do going forward in terms of improving their finances or looking at roles within the organisation. I mean, it's not particularly new. I mean, you go back to the Roman times, if you're a legionary, you would often be taken from the front line and given more, I suppose, less arduous tasks, guarding a wall or a gate. And when I started work, large organisations would find other roles within the company for people who were kind of approaching retirement. So they would go into things like working in stores, facility management, changing the light bulb or fixing the fuse, security. And a lot of these roles have now been outsourced to third parties. So it's a case of thinking about what can you do, not just within the organisation, but also helping to prepare them if they want to move outside working for the organisation itself, but other opportunities such as becoming self-employed as well.
Thank you. And then this last question to Emily. How would you describe the relationship between unpaid caring, health and work?
Well, it's one, as I mentioned before, we have carers are more likely to be in poor health than non-carers. At times they develop caring, their health is exacerbated, ill health is exacerbated by caring, or they develop new conditions as a result of caring from moving people and the sheer sort of physicality of it, as well as mental health issues. So we have these two things going on. On the one hand, you're required to be there and support your family member. On the other hand, you also have your own health issues. And this is where, when we start looking at employers and what they do, you do need to identify caring as a separate issue alongside health, because they intersect. And a lot of people don't identify themselves as carers. They don't use that word. It takes up to 2 years on average to do so. But where we see positive cultures within employers, we see really great line managers, we see good flexible working, paid carers leave, which we don't yet have in law, we do see a difference. We see a difference in carers' well-being at work. It is a positive difference, and they also tell us that stops them from giving up work in order to care. So there's a very important part to play for employers as a preventative effect, both in keeping people weller at work, keeping the labour market there, and the cost to the exchequer, or benefit to the exchequer, or productivity. Centrica looked at this and saw about 8.2 billion on the bottom line. And so Charlie Mayfield's report looked at productivity overall and saw that about 37 billion was lost to the economy because of this intersect between ill health and caring. So there's a prize for individuals, families, employers and the economy if we get this right, which we must do for them and within an ageing society.
Thank you. Big numbers at stake.
Thank you. Damien Egan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Want to focus on the Mayfield review, and the Mayfield review charts a path to keeping Britain working. And so I wanted to get your views on to what extent that path is convincing.
Do you want me to start? Yes. So there's importantly, although Sir Charlie didn't focus exclusively on caring, there are references to caring within the report. And I think we would probably like things to go a little further, if I'm honest, about having a specific piece of work looking at unpaid caring, and some of those vanguards as well that they have got some great policies to learn from. People like Phoenix, who have got, for example, a couple of weeks paid carers leave, and try and look at a positive culture within the business. So we'd like a particular focus on that. I think one area that I would like to see certainly more of is the understanding of how social care supports people to juggle work and care, whether we're talking carers or whether we're talking people with disabilities and long-term health conditions. And there's quite an important link to be made with the work of Baroness Casey at the moment and her independent review. But we think there's very positive steps forward. We also think that, taking advantage of some of the positive measures within the Employment Rights Bill, flexible working is good. But as I said, we don't yet have a right to paid carers leave, something the government has said it would review this year, and that would make a significant difference to unpaid carers and would cost, based on actual take-up rates, our predicted take-up rates, between 5 and 32 million a year. So it's a good deal for the government and for carers and for employers if we keep people in work. And those are the additional areas where I think it would really sort of benefit that work and understanding the intersection more.
Interesting, thank you.
From our perspective, we think that the Mayfield focus on prevention, inclusion and retention was a good start. We think it's a very positive step forward. I think there are a number of areas where we would want it to be strengthened. It was mentioned earlier, the phrase is employer-led, and fine with that as long as there's it's possible for the workforce and the trade unions to actually get engaged in that process, because we've seen in the past that when employer-led often means employers' views without actually taking into account the workforce. And so I think there's certainly a role for the trade union movement in that. I think there needs more clarity around the health and safety executive in sort of role as the regulator on that. For our perspective, there's no mention of statutory sick pay increase. The government have done some really good work around statutory sick pay under the new Employment Rights Act, but we think that without some either review of the broader remit of SSP or actually increasing it in some way, we think that will create a gap at the 66, 67. I should declare an interest here. I'm 6 months too late to get SPA at 66, so I blame my parents for that. And then finally, I think there's issues around NHS provision about occupational health provision and how that meets with any other national occupational health proposals. I think we need to be careful that we don't either duplicate or leave gaps between the two. So I think there's a piece of work to be done about linking those two issues there.
And then from my point of view, Arthritis UK, we absolutely welcomed the establishment of Sir Charlie Mayfield's review. We welcome the publication. We think it's necessary. We think there's a danger it won't be sufficient. I think, like Emily said, we would absolutely welcome anything that can be done to inject a bit more pace to it. I think for us, it's going to be really key for the vanguards to really get involved in terms of supporting people with fluctuating conditions such as arthritis and MSK conditions stay in work. That feels an absolute essential, along with a focus on older people. We'd be really interested to see the integration with neighbourhood health, which I think it has potential, but also has the potential to be Emperor's New Clothes if we don't get it right. So I think we need to see the join up. And I think the focus on what works is really important in terms of the Workforce Health Intelligence Unit. That's something we would absolutely like to see prioritised. I think the limitations are if it doesn't move beyond that coalition of the willing. It needs to go beyond that. And I think we have probably a healthy scepticism about how far voluntary engagement will take us, but it's absolutely necessary, just maybe not sufficient.
I like that line, coalition of the willing. Charles?
I agree with what has been said before. I mean, I think it's important to get the vanguard going as quickly as possible to find out what works, but it also is important to stress to other sized employers the importance and the opportunity that this presents. I mean, if we're able to crack it, the economy can grow, we'll have more resources. The debate about where we have the state pension age or what we link it to will become less stark because we'll have more money. So I think it's quite crucial to that it has to succeed. And that's also about building awareness among SMEs as well, that this is an important opportunity for them.
Charles, do you think that the plans will help get the certified standard put out in Mayfield adopted by other employers and other types of employers?
Well, if there are certified standards, then you could say that would you want to be working for an organisation that doesn't have this certified standard? It's going to impact on your current employees and potentially from your potential employees who you want to recruit and select. If they've got various job offers and one has the certified certificate and the other one doesn't, you might think, well, why is that? Why would I necessarily want to go and work for that organisation?
Thank you. Chair, would you like me to take the next question?
Yes, please. That's okay.
Sure, it's for you, Emily. So you run employers for carers and carers confidence schemes. What lessons have you learned about the challenges and opportunities from working with different types of employers to improve work opportunities for carers?
Thank you. Just to explain, our Employers for Carers is a forum which has around 250 employers from public and private sectors and some from voluntary sectors, covering about just over 3 million employees. And what we see is that it's really important to have a greater awareness about carers within your workforce. So if we look in the NHS, for example, 1 in 3 NHS workers, according to the staff survey, have unpaid caring responsibilities on top of what is quite often a very stressful job. The employers that we've worked with have a range of different mechanisms. Some people have mentioned midlife MOTs, working carer passports to get better dialogue with line managers, line manager training. The best ones use data within their workplace to look at who is caring, because people move in and out of caring. And where we see positive practice, we see increased well-being. Employers, and certainly anecdotal evidence shows that you also get greater buy-in and loyalty from carers who are just grateful. We have parents of disabled children with lifelong caring responsibilities, people caring for mum or dad with dementia or stroke, partners with cancer. It can happen at any time. So there really is positive culture practice. There are some sectors that are less represented, care sector, for example, in membership. And our Care Confidence scheme is a scheme that we've developed, which is a benchmarking scheme that employers have for a limited number of years and must renew. And we've had around 90 organisations go through that, and it's a good way of using reflective practice to improve. And we have quite a few looking at that across the public sector and private sector. But we would like this, to become increasingly used. So it's a very different scheme to Disability Confident, as an example. It's something which we would like, definitely to be used more broadly, but we see that you do need that separate focus and understanding about caring, and there's almost like a ladder of support, if you see what I mean, from where you can have very low-level intervention to people whose lives become very much more complex in juggling work and care, may equally have a disability or health condition and will need increased support and intervention, maybe occupational health support. So I think there is a question to ask about smaller employers as well, where the vast majority of people are supported. We find anecdotally that they can be very flexible because they know the people well. And if you're a small employer of 3-4 people and you're likely to lose an employee, that can be catastrophic on the rest of the business. But as I said, there's still an issue with unpaid carers themselves recognising themselves as carers, and sometimes a culture of fear of raising those issues within the workplace. So there's much more that we can do around awareness, identification and support, but good practice that we can work with and promote and with a good solid legislative structure. As I said, we would like to see pay up to a week of paid carers leave legislated for.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. John, can I just pick up on something that the Health Foundation raised with us, and that was that the government should try and focus on those sectors which it can influence most directly, so health, social care and education, for example. I just wondered what UNISON members have been saying about that, and whether it's generally supported.
I mean, obviously, there are large areas where we cover, but there's significant other areas where we think actually focus on jobs is really quite important. And even within those sectors, there are different roles. I mentioned ambulance in particular. So, for instance, if you compare ambulance workers to fire and police workers, they have different retirement ages, so it's very difficult for ambulance workers, even though they're manual handling all the time, all the day, more so than police and fire workers, yet they have they're not able to retire as early, they're not able to use the pension scheme the same way the fire and pension scheme is. So we did a survey of ambulance workers and it asked them what would support them to remain in role, and 87%, the top answer was a lower retirement age. So I think if you're looking specific roles and jobs within the overall sectors, I think that's there. And also, if you tend to look in other sectors like education, the focus is always on teachers, professional workers, yet 50% of people in schools are support staff, cleaners, teaching assistants and other stuff. And measures tend to be done when we have engagement with departments. They tend to start with looking at the impact of changes and mental health. So we did some work on mental health. The Department for Education did some work on mental health a few years ago, and they did it for teachers and then said, oh, well, we can just roll that over to teaching assistants and other staff. And we had to say to them, actually, they work in a completely different way. You know, often teaching assistants will work in small groups. Cleaners do not have the same relationship that they do school meals workers, technicians. These are not the same issues. So I think there are issues as well within sectoral issues, and I take the point that was made about government being able to influence from that. But sometimes it also means that you get this idea of public sector workers with their gold-plated pensions and other things like that. And I always say this, but the local government pension scheme average pension is just over £5,000. So Richard Tice may think that the local government pension scheme is an overpaid pension scheme, but I can assure you for the vast majority of low-paid workers, it is not.
Indeed. I remember when I was chair of an NHS trust and the Improving Working Lives scheme, has there been any long-term evaluation on the impact that had, for example, on keeping people in work? I seem to remember at the time it was really, really well received. So it's perhaps something that, because I know UNISON representatives were part of that, perhaps we could write to you.
And we can discuss that. I had that as a point to come to, but I'll do that. I'll try and sneak it in later.
Yes, please do. And I'm going to hand over now to Peter Bedford.
Thank you, Chair. In the previous panel, we heard of the challenges faced by older workers and some of the interventions that could be brought in. I just want to get your views on what those interventions could be in terms of an overall strategy for older workers, and also the timeliness of those interventions and when they should be brought in to best support those older workers. Emily, maybe come to you first.
So I would say that there's definitely a need for, when you look at the statistics, an over 50s approach to over 50s. We can't leave it until people get into their 60s. It's too late. So a government sort of strategy and approach to supporting the over 50s to remain in work definitely would be a positive. But there are other sort of changes that we can make that are sort of lifetime changes that contribute to people's better pension outcomes, like the Sir Charlie Mayfield's report and review, the culture of change around caring responsibilities. It's everything from a young carer coming into the workplace for the first time, being able to have good work as well as positive work and design. I talked about the benefit differential for working age people and people on pension credit, and that's where we suggested at least 2 years beforehand there is some sort of boost or adjustment for people who are caring and very unlikely to get back into the workplace. I mean, overall, we would like to see a review of carers' allowance. It'll be 50 years old on the 12th of April this year. A very important benefit, but a very big differential there for people who are just those few years away from pension age.
I don't really have much to add. I was going to say a lot of what Emily's just said around the whole idea of a 50-plus approach and a prevention-based analysis, some sort of risk-based prevention policy taken at the age of 50, taking into account the workforce you have and the threats, the particular threats and risks that happen to that workforce, I think would be very good. But I absolutely agree it has to start at 50 and not later.
Just to build on that, I don't disagree with that. I also don't think we're doing enough to take a true health in all policies approach. I don't think we are focusing enough on prevention. We know that being active, for example, can be a massive contributor to not going on to develop MSK or arthritis. We also know that poverty is a major determinant of health, and health itself is a major determinant of poverty. And so I think we need to look at that in the mix. In terms of very specific interventions to support older people to stay in work or to get back into the workplace, we've talked about reasonable adjustments before. They're really important. They're what people with arthritis tell us can make a real difference. We are told by people living with arthritis that the lack of reasonable adjustments, and I think we're finding that people are quite modest actually in the sort of reasonable adjustments they would like to see, just are not reliably happening. We're not seeing flexibility as standard. And again, people tend not to ask for the earth. Actually, people are often very circumspect about making these asks. They feel embarrassed, they feel reluctant, there's a continued stigma. So we know some of the tangible differences that can happen in the workplaces. This also doesn't happen if you don't change the culture, if you don't actually move to a place where you are looking at the positives that people can bring rather than just looking at the limitations. We recognise employers need support to make that happen, but what we are seeing day in, day out is people with arthritis and other long-term health conditions leaving the workplace when quite often they would not like to leave the workplace, and the consequence of that is they risk being plunged into poverty and financial hardship, particularly as they get older.
Only that a lot of attention has been so far given to people who leave the workforce because of caring responsibilities or physical health conditions, but also mental health is a concern as well. And I think it would be useful if the government was also to kind of use its convening power to talk about how that could be tackled, as well as the other causes of why people fall out of the workplace, as well as the initiatives that can be taken to help people back into the workplace. So, for instance, I know that the CIPD is working with the prisons ministers to help ex-offenders back into employment. We're also working with people who've taken time out because of childcare responsibilities back. So using those kind of ways of thinking about how can we look at getting those people who are 50 and over who've not been in the workplace for a number of years, how can we use those techniques to get those back into work as well, such as having testimonials from other older workers who've been successfully recruited, or reviewing the recruitment process, or perhaps even reducing the barriers. So kind of talking about, if you do come back into the workplace, this is what impact it could have on your benefits, and this is what we can do to kind of mitigate those as well.
And just thinking more broadly, are there any tangible changes that you think could be brought in to support people reaching the state retirement age over the next 5-10 years, perhaps those that are in work at the moment, to help them transition later on to a more comfortable retirement?
Well, I suppose I'll go back to, government could decide to do this benefits boost relatively quickly. We would like a positive outcome from government's review of paid carers leave. Those are very tangible things, rights and entitlements, very tangible. Unpaid carers leave, which is up to 5 days of unpaid leave now. Our analysis shows that the people who are less likely to be able to take it are on low wages. They're more likely to be carers. They're more likely to be in elementary occupations working below their potential. So these are really tangible things that government could change, as well as culture and approach to an ageing society where age discrimination is tackled as well.
I support the idea of potentially of increasing universal credit on this. However, universal credit and how it interacts with pay can be quite difficult, and sometimes you get unintended consequences. So you need to be very careful how you introduce that. We've had issues of back pay which have taken people out into universal credit and other issues. So I think certainly there would need to be a proper analysis of immediate increase of universal credit. It need to be worked out how it works out in the longer term, just because of some short-term bumps that actually when people, particularly low-paid workers, can't afford to have the gaps in work. So I just think that it would need to be introduced carefully, and you need to see how it looked.
I think given we know that people approaching state pension age can be at risk, greater risk of poverty, I think we really need to focus on income. I think part of that is making sure people are aware of existing benefits that they can claim. We know there is still underclaiming. We know that that is because of lack of awareness, but also the complications of a system that can be bewildering even to the most well-informed. I think we also really would welcome a continued focus not only on returning to work, but work retention for those people who are able to work. And for those that aren't, I really think we need to model different ways of providing that additional financial support. We know it is harming people financially if they're not able to work, particularly as they get older. I think other witnesses may have talked about loosening conditionality on people who, as they get older, when it's really quite clear that they're going to struggle to find work, and that's something we'd absolutely support. I also think the government needs to take a joined-up approach on this. We know people are still dropping out of the workplace because they are waiting a long time for treatment. We know that the government has that on its radar, but still day in, day out, operations are cancelled, physio appointments are being cancelled, or people are waiting a long time. And if we don't get that right, we're going to continue to see people drop out of the workplace when actually it's in their interest and society's interest for them to work.
If there's enough money, perhaps the government could look at cutting the employer national insurance contributions that are paid for older workers, so that would incentivise employers to employ more older workers because they were it was a lot less costly to do so.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Rishnara Ali.
Thank you, Chair. As you know, the increase in pension age will go up as of April from 66 to 67, and that was legislated for in 2014. There aren't mitigations in terms of social security support. Can you talk us through what you think the government could do, given the short time frame? I'll start with Emily.
So, it would be great to see the government put in some mitigations now in that year, certainly longer if possible, for those who are very close, very challenging getting back into work. I think, some of the issues around conditionality now, unpaid carers are not subject to conditionality on universal credit if they get carers allowance, for example. That's very, very important. But for those, it's so hard to go back to work when you've got a shortage of social care services, health services not tailored around your needs. So the income protection is really important. I'd also suggest as well, because when we ask carers what would you have done differently when giving up work to care, and they said I would have stayed in work for longer and I would have contributed my pension more, I would have asked for help earlier. All those things can be prevented by better information, better advice, sort of more day-to-day discussions about caring in our lives. And that even at that age, at 66, that could be a positive discussion for people. So I think that information and advice is also really, really important. Obviously better to get it earlier in your life, but it still can be done at that point.
Joe.
Yeah, I do want to say that at a time that we are all being urged to plan ahead and take a longer term view, it's beyond disappointing that we are here in 2026 talking about mitigations for something that was announced in 2014. I nothing but welcome the inquiry's focus on this. I think there are some things that can be done and should be done. I think in terms of mitigations to support people to stay at work, reasonable adjustments. We think we would benefit from renewed guidance on how reasonable adjustments can work for employers and for people requesting them. So I think that is something tangible. I don't want to give up the ghost. We know that this isn't just about apolitics onwards. And so I really would urge the government to look at modelling different ways of taking mitigating actions that are going to prevent people pre-retirement being plunged into poverty needlessly at great harm to them. So I would like to see that modelling. The government is talking about saving £10 billion. I think it will be short-sighted if some of that money is not redeployed towards mitigation.
So the IFS has done some of the modelling, and it's
Absolutely.
between 200 and 600 million if you focus just on those with disabilities versus a more wider group. That's a small percentage of what the savings would be. So do you think they should be pursuing that?
I absolutely think they should be looking at the modelling, and I think when we come to looking at future increases in state pension age, we need to plan for them properly, and we also need to recognise that healthy life expectancy is not keeping pace with life expectancy, and that is one of the major fault lines, really, that we are seeing played out day in, day out.
Charles, do you want to come on?
Well, it's not my area of expertise, but if I look at what happened in the workplace with pensions before auto-enrolment, we had great benefits. Very few people actually ticked the box, despite various campaigns. So the government introduced auto-enrolment. So my concern with any mitigations, if people have to go through various hoops to kind of claim it, that could be a problem. So it may be that it's simple to say, well, people in these lowest council tax bands will target those people because they're going to be the most people most at risk of falling into poverty because of the increase.
I think I've already mentioned the changes to statutory sick pay. I think would be really important. You could look at ways of the criteria of how you help. We could look at ask people like the Industrial Injuries Advisory Committee. They already do work about this. You could target particular issues, arthritis or whatever particularly we think it'd be useful. I think the establishment of the Workplace Health Intelligence Unit, which was touched on a bit earlier, I think that could be sped up because actually that could produce some really useful data to be based on that, consistent data, leadership, clear idea. And I think that, as with my colleague, it's very late to be doing this. And I think that, I think those are perhaps sort of areas if you're going to focus, you'd focus on those.
Is it irresponsible to have not had mitigations in place just given it's 12 years since the legislation came into effect, and what can be learned from that?
Well, I mean, if you're going to introduce a policy, then you need to set a series of long-term policy of how you deal with policy, don't you? I mean, it's standard government policy, that you set in train a policy. There should be a implementation plan that sets out what's likely to happen, which should be reviewed throughout the whole process. It's standard employment. Every employer sets themselves project plans and ways of dealing with things, and clearly there hasn't been one. It hasn't been thought through.
I would agree. If I look at the inequalities that carers face, they are going to be exacerbated because of the lack of mitigations.
And just finally, do you think that there's a case? Well, first of all, have any of you got sort of estimates of how many people are going to be pushed into numbers of people are going to be pushed into poverty because of the lack of mitigation, and beyond obviously these specific policy changes, is there anything else that the government should be planning for given the short time frame before it comes into effect?
I think I mentioned earlier, Age UK reckon 115,000 people will be pushed into poverty as a result of that. So, I think that's a significant number directly. And if you hadn't, if this has been known for some time, there's no implementation plan, I think that's really dangerous. In terms of what you can do about it, I think that it's tricky now, isn't it? April, it's very tricky.
Yep. I mean, just to pick up, I think I mentioned earlier research we carried out which showed that people in the 55 to 64 age group were twice as likely to find life financially challenging, to struggle to make ends meet as those over 65. So although we haven't modelled it, I think we can be nothing but confident that there will be a detrimental impact on people living with arthritis of the increase in state pension age.
Arthur, did you want to add anything else?
No, I mean, I think the lessons are that if the state pension age goes up again, then it would be quite good to have mitigations in place for when that happens.
Thank you.
Amanda Hack. Thank you, Chair. This is just a sort of a follow-on question from a couple that have pulled together and crossing over the inquiry we're doing now, but with other inquiries too. I just wanted to ask Charles, if possible, about the point that Joe raised on reasonable adjustments and the work that we need to be done with employers to encourage more activity about employees feeling confident to ask about reasonable adjustments, but also about what work we could do with employers to enable that to happen more broadly.
I think it's bringing down, I suppose, trying to encourage a culture of trust. I mean, if you go back 30 or 40 years ago, people very rarely talked about their sexuality or their marriage status or caring responsibilities or much about their background. But now people are more open about if they've got a mental health condition. So I think, but obviously we recognise that's not all within, equally spread out. So we've got to kind of encourage not only just employees to kind of broach these subjects, but also employers, how they then think about this in a sensitive way. That, I mean, the Mayfield report talks about employees being scared about talking about this, but also it can be scary for employers thinking, well, how do I deal with this? What's the best approach? And it can even be more so, as was mentioned earlier, if you're in a micro or small business with about 20 people and you've got 2 or 3 people with these health conditions. Where do you get the support from? Where do you get the advice? So it's important that if the government was to do anything, it could help small and medium-sized organisations access HR support, occupational health support. So you can have discussions about how best to have these stay in work plans.
Lovely, thank you. I mean, just very quickly to Joe and to Emily, just thinking around the phraseology about disability confident employers. In your experience with your organisations, has that made a difference to the people that you are engaging with day to day?
I mean, first thing I should say is that Arthritis UK, we're proud to be a disability confident employer. Also, I mean, actually, if I reflect on the almost 12 months I've spent working for the charity, it's a joy and a privilege to work for an organisation that genuinely feels like it's taking reasonable adjustments seriously. And having spent most of my career in the charity sector, I can even say that's not always a given in the charity sector, let alone elsewhere. So I think that makes a real difference. I think disability confidence, I mean, it is absolutely good rather than a negative. I think it can still be quite hit and miss, and I think it can still depend a lot on implementation, and it also only covers a minority of jobs that exist in this country, which is why we need schemes that go way beyond that, and we need a cultural shift.
Emily, did you have anything?
I would agree with Joe, really, and there are different, as our Care Confident scheme, as I set out, is quite different. It requires a much greater level of evidence to be able to achieve what we have, but it is the coalition of the willing. I just also wanted to mention as well that because unpaid caring is not a protected characteristic, carers don't have a right to reasonable adjustments. So culture change, although there's just prevention from discrimination and harassment in terms of associated with disability in their own right, that's not seen. I mean, that's something we would like to see, caring as the 10th protected characteristic. But there's an opportunity as well, I think, just to mention equality action plans. There's an opportunity there to reinforce positive culture and demonstrate with employers to demonstrate what they are doing for disabled colleagues and other areas to look at disability employment gaps and reinforce messages around reasonable adjustments as well.
Lovely. And Emily, finally, in your evidence, you indicated that this is about an employment boost pre-retirement. I'd be really interested to see what the other panellists felt about, at what age additional support you feel should come in pre the retirement, and if anyone had a view on that.
I think, to be honest, I don't think it should be age-related. Okay. I think that actually you in a risk-based culture, in a sort of a prevention-based culture, you analyse them early on. If someone comes to you and they need reasonable adjustments, you need to recognise if you want to keep that worker on for a long, long time, you need to put reasonable adjustments in, and they may adjust over time. I think what happens sometimes, we've talked about reasonable adjustments, is the adjustments made, but actually, conditions worsen and those adjustments aren't changed. I think that's a real problem.
Joe, I think I'd just add a reflection that although people of all ages can get arthritis, you are more likely to get it as you get older, and you are more likely to be living with multiple long-term conditions. I think all of those can make working so much more problematic. I think if we're looking at any additional mitigations, whilst in an ideal world, we would look at individual circumstances and recognising that people of all ages are at risk of being in poverty. If they have a long-term disability, the older you are, the more problematic it can be. And so we would welcome any mitigation is better than no mitigation, I think is what I would be saying at this stage.
Thank you, Joe. Charles,
I think the challenge is that there doesn't seem to be a clear explanation of why the state pension exists. What is the challenge or opportunity or problem it's trying to solve? So I think until you start to have a discussions about what is the reason for having the state pension, then it's going to kind of confuse. You'll end up using it as a kind of a Swiss Army knife to kind of deal with various problems in the workplace or outside the workplace. So I think you've got to be really clear about what you expect the state pension age to do, and the state pension to do, and what else you expect then the government or employers or employees themselves to kind of do as well.
Thank you, Chair, for allowing me to go off base.
And that concludes the evidence from this panel. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us and for your evidence to us today.